As a child, I spent time at my great-grandmother's house, my dad's grandmother, Little Gram, as we called her, because she was about 4'8". And she was Armenian, and she was an amazing cook, and she had the greatest scratch and sniff book ever. No matter how many times I scratched at it, it still smelled. And she would just always have a kind word for me and a warm hug. And as a child, I will never forget the day where I realized that she had a tattoo on her forearm. And I asked her, "Little Gram, why do you have numbers there on your arm?" And my mother distracted me quickly so that she could move on from that conversation. And it turned out those numbers were tattooed on her as a child during the Armenian genocide by the Turks, and her entire family had been killed. And so my great-grandma did not really want to talk about that. But what she never really told me, but I have learned as a child in that family, is that my great-grandfather was living in the U.S., and he did not know what to do for his people in Armenia in the midst of their horrible plight. And so he did what he could do, and he went over to the orphanage and got a woman, a girl who was just about of age. She was 17, and she said, "I can help that one." And he married her and brought her to the U.S. with him. Now, history tends to repeat itself. The Armenian genocide was not the first attempt at one part of the population attempting to eliminate another part of the population. And as you heard Marlene tell the story from Exodus, we encounter this new Pharaoh who must have been, for some reason, filled with all kinds of anger and fear about these Hebrew people, the ones who were enslaved. These ones who were once led by Joseph, who were strong in number and strong in strength. And Pharaoh's fear and anger, we can guess, is what led him to attempt to eliminate the Hebrew people. And so his attempts to control this population are akin to genocide, to kill off the boys by throwing them into the Nile River. But the story doesn't end here. I think I keep saying this week after week, where we have this horrible situation, but the story doesn't end there. And as Marlene alluded to, enter the girls and the women in the story of Moses in the basket. The very ones that Pharaoh didn't seem to be too concerned about because he only wanted to kill the boy childs. So we have the astonishing story of bravery of the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who were told to kill all those boy childs, but they claimed that they just couldn't get to those Hebrew women in time. It was such a sad story. And then we're told that they lied. They pretty much lied to Pharaoh's face and told him that there was no chance. They couldn't do it. And it was that example where sometimes bearing false witness saves lives. But it's not just those midwives. We have more women entering into this story. We have Moses' mother, who kept him a secret. We can almost imagine that she wrapped him up and kept him close to keep him quiet. She did what she had to do to save her son. And then she did put him in the river, like she was supposed to, but she put him in a basket that was lined so the basket wouldn't sink, and had his sister watch out to see what would happen. And then Pharaoh's own daughter sees the baby and saves the baby and finds a wet nurse for him, his own mother, convenient. So there's a whole conspiracy taking place to save the Hebrew boys. Particularly, we hear the story of Moses. And so this story that starts out with anger and fear starts to have glimmers of amazing hope and promise. As we hear the story of one of the greatest figures of the Bible, Moses, And Moses' leadership and teaching is one of those foundational stories. We learn it as Sunday school kids. It shapes us. And yet, without the women in this story, we might not ever know this story. Without the midwives, there would be no Moses. And without Moses' mother doing what he had to do, and Moses' sister watching out for that basket, there would be no Moses. And without Pharaoh's own daughter, there would be no Moses. So it seems like it's kind of a small story in the big arc of Moses' story, but the little ripples that happen with each woman interfering in this story changes it. Each ripple changes the story's future. But this story of the basket, of Moses in the basket, is not the only time where women have played a key role. Take this piece of art. Mrs. Nuthall Brighton, who's on your left there, and Mrs. Doris Vidito is on your right in this picture. They are literally keepers of love. They are the guardians and caretakers of Love Cemetery, which is a 175-year-old slave and African-American burial ground in East Texas. Now, at the height of the 1960s civil rights movement, this cemetery, Love Cemetery, was locked. And for nearly 40 years, descendants of those buried in there were denied access. And these women, together with a writer, China Galland, started a movement to have the cemetery reopened, to have it restored, to have it reconsecrated. And they worked together. They uncovered the stories of the people buried there. They worked together to build a multiracial community in that town to work to restore this cemetery. And so in this picture, you see these women sitting at the restored headstone of Ohio Taylor, who was the great-grandfather of Mrs. Vidito, and he lived through slavery. Now, these two women, I didn't know their names. You probably didn't know their names or their story. So they're not famous in a big sense. But they changed a piece of history. Women, people, all people have the capacity to do small things that ripple out and change the course of history, that ripple out and make the world a better place. The women in Moses' early life changed the story not only for him, but for all of the Hebrew people who are led out of slavery to the promised land, and it is a story of liberation and faithfulness and hope that we continue to tell. Mrs. Brighton and Mrs. Vidito changed the story for the families of those loved ones who were buried at Love Cemetery. My great-grandfather changed the story for my little Graham and all of the generations that will come after. We, too, have the capacity to do small acts, to listen to those nudges from God, to do these little things, to change the story. Acts that are potentially dangerous, as the midwives who intentionally defied Pharaoh could have encountered. We have the capacity to do small acts, or big ones, that can right wrongs that have been done. We have the capacity to do small acts or big ones that can make the world a better place for just one person. We can change the story. If we listen to those nudges from God, our ordinary acts can take on new meaning and new purpose. Our small, ordinary acts can create ripple effects in small ways that we might not even see the results of, that work to bring about God's realm here on earth. Now, we certainly don't have Pharaoh telling us to kill someone else's little baby, but there is voices of hate prevalent in our world that we can do small things to combat. There's enormous fear of the other in our world that we can combat with overwhelming love, acts of overwhelming love. We don't have to do it all. We don't have to single-handedly end a genocide, but we can do small somethings. And when we do our small somethings, we can trust that God can work on the ripples. And so I invite us to be like the women in the story and do our little bit, and to trust God to do God's part of changing the story. Amen.